Well, how many of you guessed syphilis? I wouldn't say too many. Seems health was a concern for them on a ship. So just to explain for those of you who are like, I don't understand, syringe for treating syphilis. Syphilis is an STD. It is transmitted through things that cause STDs. I would then, if we were in class, ask you, what do they use to treat syphilis with? Somebody would say, oh, today we use penicillins. Yes, we do. But they didn't have that until very recently, very recent invention, penicillin. Instead, they treated syphilis up until, gosh, really quite recently with mercury, which is a very toxic liquid metal. And this is a syringe for injecting it into the sores where you got the syphilis from. And the sores would appear, the places, well, all over, but to begin with, on the place where the contact was first made. There's only one on board. Let's hope there's just one person having a really rough time of it. Otherwise, that syringe has been a few places. Yeah, I'm ending this semester on a real low note here, haven't I? Yeah. They also found other things that belong to the people on board and tells us about their lives. Kitchenware, pewter plates, cups, jugs, cutlery, decorated knife handles, ceramics, food residue, animal bones showing butcher marks, even wooden knit combs for them to keep nits out of their hair. The ship itself was a big, strong one called a naus, Portuguese style of ship. It had 3 or 4 decks. And we can see from the finds the technology that they had for the day, which was quite advanced for that time period. Without this technological advancement, they wouldn't have been able to do what they were doing. They found the picture on the right here. These are 3 astrolabes. Now, these have been developed in the 8th and 9th centuries by the Arabs, who had based it on an ancient Greek technology, and then it was introduced into Europe from the 11th century. What the astrolabe did was determine the orientation of astronomical bodies like the sun or the pole star, and this allowed east-west distance to be calculated and the latitude that they were at. They also found compasses for giving directions on board, and they found charting and navigating dividers, meaning they were making their own maps or had their own maps anyway, which did not survive. They also had what we call a sounding lead, which you would tie onto a piece of rope or string, smear like Vaseline or something sticky on the bottom, drop it down, gives you an idea of the depth of the water, pull it up, be bits of the sand or mud stuck to the bottom of the sounding lead where the Vaseline was, and if you knew what you were looking at and you knew a bit of geology, you could work out roughly where you were from that. That's a very old technique. To protect against pirates and enemy ships, they had large muzzle-loading guns. They had smaller swivel guns. They also had very large bronze cannons that were already loaded with stone cannonballs. Muskets and swords were also found. So many swords that they think the swords might also have been trade items. Go and read more about the shipwreck, including how they don't find any people on board, and the article that I've posted on Moodle. I've only given you a taster. It looks like it's tough going, that article, but I think you'll agree, reading about, blokes with syphilis protecting themselves from pirates is an interest, one of the better academic articles I'll make you read. So, the impact of the world on Europe. Goods, stuff, had a huge impact. Now, you probably no doubt heard the term plantation before, and a plantation is a operation that focuses on the production of a single item, like sugar or coffee, indigo or cotton. This means because they're focusing on one thing, they have to import everything else they need to keep the place running. So ships would bring the results of the plantations from the Americas to Europe. So like raw sugar and molasses from America to Europe. And in Europe, it would be refined into white sugar or put into wine. And then in exchange, Europe would send to the plantations in the Americas cloth, manufactured goods, and the machines that they need. Ships also took flour and lumber from North America to South America and Caribbean plantations, where they in turn collected sugar and rum. When we then add West Africa to the equation, and they are trading slaves, we end up with a big triangle. And so historians have accurately, for a change, called this system triangle trade. One part of the triangle trade, the saddest part by a long way, is the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage is referring to the fact that it's the middle leg of the triangle trade. It is the bottom of the picture on the right. It's the movement of slaves from Africa to the Americas. Because, well, as we're going to see, they did not have very many locals to force to work on these plantations. There was hard work in the plantations. To make it profitable, they imported slave labor. So the Middle Passage has become known as an economic term for the trade of slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. Another thing they got out of the South America and Central America in particular was silver. And the silver fueled and sped up with these global trading connections. Silver and gold went to Spain in huge armed convoys, to the point where in like the 16th century, the Spanish monarchy was getting a quarter of its annual income from its mines in the Americas. Most of these links were pretty beneficial for Europeans. No, not for everybody else, spoiler alert. This is what environmental historian Alfred Crosby has termed the Columbian Exchange. This was the travel of foodstuffs and animals and other biological things across the Atlantic. So in this way, Europeans brought horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and chickens from Europe to the Americas, where they actually often escaped into the wild and absolutely thrived. For example, the Spanish abandoned a herd of cattle in the Rio de la Plata region of Argentina. They forgot about them. They went back a couple of decades later and found that the herd of cattle they forgot about had grown to over 100,000 random cows. Indeed, that is still a major beef producing region of the world. They realised, the Europeans that is, realised that wheat grew really well on the plains of the Americas. So did wine grapes, so did apples, so did olives. From Africa, they brought bananas, coffee, and coconuts to the Americas to grow. Maize, what you guys call corn, but in Europe corn can also mean wheat. So we talk maize specifically, we don't use corn because it's too confusing. But maize and potatoes are probably the best known items from the Americas that were successfully brought back to Europe. At first, they were both used as food for animals, but then their nutritional value for humans was soon recognised. Tomatoes, peppers, sweet potatoes, peanuts, pineapples, avocados, manioc, they went from South America to Africa and Asia and Europe. In fact, about 30% of the food eaten worldwide today originated from the Americas. There was a huge impact of this food on the population of Europe because their nutrition improved hugely. With better food comes a boom in population. Products of pleasure also made it to Europe. Chocolate. Chocolate came from the Aztecs and Mayas who cultivated cacao beans. Cortez was the one who brought them to Spain, and the Spanish developed the habit of drinking cups of chocolate, which they sweetened with the imported sugar. Drinking chocolate then became trendy and spread to France and England. The next trend by the 1600s were coffee, and they imported that from Africa and Arabia. And by the 1650s, tea was the thing, which they were importing from China and India. Native Americans chewed and smoked tobacco, and Columbus, even on his very first voyage, brought tobacco back with him. In Spain, farmers used the tobacco seeds to grow tobacco there. They believed that it had a medicinal use and made people relax. Jean Nicot was one of the great salesmen for smoking, and it's from him that we get the term nicotine, the addictive drug in tobacco. He was French ambassador to Lisbon in Portugal, and he introduced snuff to France. It spread rapidly from that point onwards and became hugely popular, though actually they did, despite what, the likes of Mad Men and all of that leads you to believe. They did, even people at the time realize that smoking was bad for you. When I was doing my PhD, I read an account from very early 1600s, from a guy called Josias Bodley, who was recounting his vacation. And he obviously got drunk, and he went on a massive rant about how much he hated smokers and how he bet when they cut them open, their lungs would be black. So even in the early 1600s, they knew smoking could be bad from you. Now, these goods were all carried in European ships. So it meant that the Europeans kept all the profits from all of this trade. They were the ones who dictated what were going on. So all of this also stimulated industry in Europe, from shipbuilding to textile production, because the Europeans were exporting manufactured goods in exchange for cheaper raw materials like sugar and metals. Another impact was that warfare was no longer contained within Europe. And last class we finished off in this period of religious war. Well, now Europe is deciding, hey, let's not fight these wars on our own borders. Let's fight them somewhere else. Spain was the most powerful country as a result of this global expansion, and both the French and the English tried to weaken Spain by cutting off their trade with the Americas. Europeans quickly came to view sustained contact with the rest of the world as essential to military power. The English famously encouraged privateers, really government-sanctioned pirates, and their job was to attack Spanish treasure ships. Sir Francis Drake is probably the most famous of all these privateers, and he was so successful at this that he got a knighthood in the deal from Queen Elizabeth I of England. Drake began his life as a slave trader, and he ended it a lord and a member of Parliament. Now, I'm going to come back to Las Casas and his noble savages in a second while explaining the other aspect of the Columbian exchange that people always forget about because they're too busy thinking how great chocolate is. And that is that it's things that are biological, and therefore that includes disease. So the Columbian exchange was not just about goods and technology, it also applied to germs. And this overall makes it a bad thing. I mean, tropical diseases kept Europeans out of the African interior for a long time, but it was very different in the Americas. Sailors going across the Atlantic brought pretty common European diseases with them, like measles, mumps, bubonic plague, the influenza, smallpox. The American natives had no natural resistance to these. In some places, 90% of the native population was killed by European disease. For the diseases to spread, only one native had to contact a European to return and then spread the germs just by doing normal things, carrying about their daily lives. The natives became so sick and died so quickly that Europeans record in their primary sources that they arrived at new villages to find the inhabitants all dead already or very weak indeed. Now, this was actually, they were hindered by how technologically advanced they were. For example, the Inca had an extensive system of roads and bridges, and this allowed the germs to be carried very, very swiftly. The huge drop in population allowed the Europeans to set up huge land-based empires as they found so little opposition. This was the case famously at Tenochtitlan. Hernando Cortés entered the city with his forces. He was expelled after a battle because his men had behaved very badly. They left behind smallpox germs, which had a devastating impact on the Aztecs. It reduced the opposition that the Aztecs could mount, so that by 1521, that's only 2 years after this event at Tenochtitlan, Cortés controlled the whole Aztec empire. Smallpox is called smallpox to distinguish it from the great pox, which is syphilis. We estimate that around 30 million Native Americans were killed within the 120 years of first contact with Europeans, mainly due to smallpox. That's about 90% of their population. It has been what environmental scholars have called a virgin soil epidemic, in that people had no natural tolerance to the disease. They were so new to them, it was virginal. The impact that this had on Africans was also terrible. If I flick back here to this slide, when we get to Las Casas and his noble savages, Las Casas was a Spaniard working amongst the natives in the Americas, seeing them dying of smallpox, seeing the terrible conditions that they were being worked into, and wrote a book about where he called the native people noble savages. And this book became a bestseller, not in Spain, because he was really slagging off Spain, but very popular in Spain's enemies, England, France. As a result, the rulers were increasingly reluctant to use the native populations for the back-breaking work required on plantations. So, they still needed the work. They're not going to do it themselves. They've got white privilege even back then. What are they going to do? Import more slaves forcibly from Africa. In return, there's syphilis. There were debates about whether syphilis was the disease that made its way from the Americas to Europe, but it is now pretty well argued that actually syphilis had been around long before 1494. Before we were able to sort of say, yeah, it was around, the two main areas of thought about it were the Columbian hypothesis and the pre-Columbian hypothesis. Pre-Columbian hypothesis seems to have won out, that syphilis was in Europe before the era of Columbus. The Columbian hypothesis was that one of Columbus's soldiers was up to no good, caught syphilis from a local and brought it back to Europe with him. The pre-Columbian hypothesis being proved by our increased knowledge of science. As you know, medieval people are lovely and vague about diseases. They just are, they just call everything sickness or pestilence. So we couldn't rely on the written documentation to prove that syphilis was already there. Even before this research, the scientific research, I always did think it was suspicious that, it was like, we killed 90% of the native population through smallpox, but it's all right, we got syphilis in return. I'm like, I'm not convinced by this. You're just trying to make yourself feel better, and you shouldn't feel better. Smallpox and killing off 120 million people is way worse than syphilis, even though, yes, syphilis ruined many people's lives. By the way, on that note, I don't see you, so I don't need to see how embarrassed you get, but there is a syphilis outbreak in Missouri at the moment, so make sure that you remember that. It ain't a ye olde disease, it is still kicking around, so be careful with what you do. The treatment today is easier, but just you remember, if you're like, that they used to shove this here syringe somewhere where you don't want that syringe to be shoved with mercury in it, which would have poisoned you. So the treatment was worse than the disease. Your other alternative was guaiacum, a New World tree, which was another early treatment for syphilis. It also didn't work. So on that happy note, with smallpox, syphilis coming so soon after the Black Death, I say my farewells to you as we now live in a COVID-19 world. I hope this has not been too triggering. Instead, I hope to have shown you that human beings are blimmin' resilient. We have been through all sorts of diseases and we've come out the other end somehow, and this will be no different. It all sucks at the moment, but it could suck more. Somebody could be trying to shove a syringe of mercury up your you-know-what. So it could suck more. So I want you all to take care of yourselves and read the instructions for the final exam next week. And I hope you all do awesome, and I hope you all get out of lockdown soon. And if you really enjoyed this class and are thinking, you know what, maybe history isn't as bad as I thought it was in high school, remember you can always be a history major. As I said, this class links into so many other awesome history classes that you could take, even at the 100 level. But if you're like, you know what, I want to do more history, we do take minors. You don't even have to change your major. And next semester, fall semester, I'm teaching a 300 level course called Medieval History. And in that class, we are going to play with our new medieval document acquisitions to the library, like actually get to like handle them and do cool things. And we're also going to create our own class manuscript, and I think probably about our experiences during COVID-19. So we'll like do some actual primary source history writing, but we're going to do it as an illuminated manuscript using the techniques that they used in the Middle Ages. So like you'll get to like make yucky ink and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So it's going to be a freaking awesome class. So if you're like, I have a spare 3 hours, you've already got the knowledge background, come take 362 Medieval Europe, although I warn you now, there's only like 3 spaces left in it. So you want to make your own illuminated manuscript, you don't have much time to do it in. If not, I hope that if nothing else, you've got a new way of thinking about the world from this class, and you've learned lots of gross things to ick your friends out. See you again, many of you. Bye.